Organizations like the BBC, they've always had a strong bias against India. This has been in place since the Indians got independence. And these people always seem to focus on India as a country which has a huge problem, even though there are countries around the world engulfed in civil wars, massive civil rights violations and things like that, but India seems to be a large focus of a lot of these organizations when it comes to painting countries in a negative light. In fact, they've also started to show this kind of bias towards their own people now. So whenever there is an issue, these organizations tend to paint a one-sided picture of that issue. And when they're talking about India as well, they're specifically talking about the Hindus. They talk about how the Hindus are horrible people whose sole goal is to persecute the minorities, persecute women, and persecute everybody around them. So when an incident actually happens, rather than talk to organizations that represent Hindus as well, like Seva, like HSS, like the VHP, there's tons of organizations that they could talk to. They don't talk to these organizations, and they go talk to the communists, they go talk to the leftists, and they go talk to the Islamists who already have a bone to pick with the Hindus. Those are the kind of people that the BBC goes to take interviews and to give their opinions about India. What the hell kind of narrative are you expecting from them? A few years ago, people remember that documentary that came out, India's Daughter, that made a lot of headlines in India and made a lot of headlines overseas as well. The documentary was made by the BBC after a horrific rape of a young girl in Delhi. But when BBC came out with a documentary, it wanted to portray a narrative that somehow rape and sexual assault was only a massive problem in India. It was not a problem anywhere else as big as it was in India. They tried to paint this narrative that India is the rape capital of the world and that a rape happens in India every 22 minutes. Actually, some news leaked recently that what happened was when the movie was initially screened in Delhi, they were also talking about other incidences of sexual assault in other parts of the globe to give proper perspective. Modi, a guy that was democratically elected in an absolute majority by the people of India. BBC has been on a years-long witch hunt against Modi as well. BBC doesn't like to talk about a lot of riots in India, but it cannot stop talking about the 2002 riots. And also, they don't like to tell the full story of the 2002 riots about how the riots actually started. When there was an attack by a Muslim crowd on the Sabarmati train where 56 Hindus, 32 of those were women and children, were burnt alive like animals. Nobody likes to mention that. And there's reasons for this as well. You know, like a senior editor of BBC is sitting in London and they send their correspondents to India and they've never set foot in India themselves, so they have a certain idea about India and they're expecting their correspondents to send them articles and send them pieces of news that conform to that idea. Then even the foreign correspondents that spend time in India spend about 3 to 5 years maximum. And in 3 to 5 years, living in just the large metropolitan cities like Delhi, you're not going to get an idea of what India is and who the Indians are. Living in Delhi, you go to the same cocktail parties with the same journalists and the same people, and you hear the same kind of a narrative. The narratives like secularism, oh, minorities are in danger, Hindu fundamentalism, human rights in Kashmir, saffron terrorism, and things like that. And so that is why, even while acknowledging the massive bias that exists in organizations like the BBC, we still, as Indians, have to take a large share of the blame for that as well, because it is often the Indian journalists, it is often the Indian mainstream news media that gives the information to the BBC and to all of the other international outlets. That is where a lot of these international outlets get their news and their narratives from. And when the mainstream media is pushing the narrative that Hindus are evil, India is an evil country, Hindus are an evil population, then that narrative is obviously going to seep into overseas mainstream organizations as well. So again, our own people create more problems for us than overseas people ever could. And then again, that narrative and that bias is coming back to bite the BBC in the ass. Because you can see now that among the Hindus of Britain and among their own people, organizations like the BBC are quickly losing credibility. Many Hindu groups in the UK have said that they've lost complete faith in the BBC. And even many British people who want to save their culture and who want to preserve their culture are losing faith in the BBC because those people are being painted as xenophobes and racists and assholes by the BBC. I love that the BBC loves to report on sexual abuse in India as soon as it happens, but it actually turned a blind eye and it actually tried to cover up massive cases of sexual assault like Rotherham, where 1,500 young girls were sexually abused by predominantly Pakistani Muslim men. That incident was ignored by organizations like the BBC for years. And even when it was covered, the Pakistani Muslim men that were involved in these grooming operations were being referred to as Asians. It's not a gang of Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese men that are going around sexually assaulting these women. It is a gang of Pakistani Muslim men. And Rotherham wasn't the only grooming case that they ignored. There are scores of other cases all around Britain that the BBC continued to ignore as well, until people like Tommy Robinson started fighting to bring these pieces of news into the public eye. And he started calling out the mainstream organizations like the BBC on hiding, covering up, and ignoring these pieces of news. And that is why organizations like the BBC hate Tommy Robinson and hate the people that follow Tommy Robinson. Not just Indians who are trying to preserve their culture, but even British people who are trying to preserve their culture are seen as horrible people by organizations like the BBC. And that is showing among the UK population as well, because in 2017, the percentage of people in the UK who said that they trusted the media fell to 24%. So only 24% of the British population now trust the media. It is important that we recognize this bias, and it is important that if anybody from Britain is watching this, that there are linkages here, and that we need to talk about this bias together as the British, together as Indians, and together as the British and Indians.